It happened in a closed-door meeting that was never supposed to become public. Joseph Neguse, the golden boy of Democratic leadership, the man who climbed from Colorado State Regent to Assistant House Minority Leader, faster than anyone thought possible, was sitting confidently in his leather chair when Jasmine Crockett walked into the room. What she said next would shatter his carefully constructed image and expose the dirty truth about how power really works in Washington. But to understand why her words hit like a political earthquake, you need to know the secret that both of them have been hiding from the American people. The secret that explains everything about why Congress is broken, why young progressives are being silenced, and why the establishment will do anything to protect their own. This isn't just another political squabble. This is the moment when the mask came off, when the gloves came off, and when someone finally had the courage to say what everyone else was thinking but nobody dared to speak out loud. Joseph Neguse had always been the perfect political success story. Born to immigrant parents from Eritrea, Harvard law educated, a natural coalition builder who could work across the aisle without breaking a sweat. He was everything the Democratic Party wanted to showcase: young, diverse, articulate, and most importantly, controllable. When he won his first congressional election in 2018, the party establishment immediately saw his potential. They fast-tracked him through leadership positions at a speed that made seasoned politicians dizzy. Freshman leadership representative in his first term, co-chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee in his second, chairman in his third, and now Assistant House Minority Leader in his fourth. It was a meteoric rise that had never been seen before in modern congressional history, and it made him virtually untouchable within the party hierarchy. But there was something about Neguse's rise that bothered other members of Congress, especially the younger, more progressive voices, who felt like they were being systematically excluded from real power. While Neguse was collecting titles and photo opportunities with party leadership, representatives like Jasmine Crockett were doing the real work of holding Republicans accountable, going viral for their fearless confrontations, and actually connecting with the American people. Crockett, the civil rights attorney from Texas, who had spent her pre-congressional career defending people who couldn't defend themselves, watched as Neguse collected accolades for bipartisanship, while she was out there taking real political risks. The contrast was stark, and it was starting to become a problem that the party leadership couldn't ignore much longer. The tension had been building for months before that fateful meeting. Crockett had been making waves with her aggressive questioning style in committee hearings, her viral social media presence, and her willingness to call out hypocrisy wherever she found it. Her bleach blonde, bad-built butch body moment had made her a household name and showed the world that some Democrats were finally ready to fight fire with fire. Meanwhile, Neguse was being praised in academic studies as the second most effective House Democrat based on legislation passed, but critics were starting to question what kind of legislation he was actually getting through. Was he really being effective, or was he just good at getting his name on bills that were going to pass anyway? Was his bipartisan reputation genuine, or was he simply avoiding the tough fights that needed to be fought? The breaking point came when Crockett announced her intention to challenge Debbie Dendle for the chairmanship of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, the same position that Neguse had held until he moved up to assistant leader. What made Crockett's challenge even more threatening to the establishment was her obvious appeal to the party's base. While Neguse was popular with donors and political insiders, Crockett was the one who could pack rallies, trend on social media, and get people excited about Democratic politics. She represented something that the party desperately needed but couldn't figure out how to control: authentic grassroots energy that couldn't be manufactured or managed from the top down. Her challenge to Dendle wasn't just about one committee position. It was about whether the Democratic Party was going to continue rewarding insider politics or start elevating people who could actually inspire and mobilize voters. But Jasmine Crockett had not come to that meeting to be lectured about patience or institutional norms. She had come with receipts, with hard questions, and with a willingness to say things that nobody else had been brave enough to articulate. When Neguse started his usual speech about party unity and the importance of experience, Crockett cut him off with a question that changed everything. "Joe, when was the last time you actually fought for something that mattered to our voters?" What Crockett said next would eventually leak out of that room and spread through Democratic circles like wildfire, but in that moment it was just two people having the conversation that the party had been avoiding for years. "You've been in leadership for 6 years," she continued, "and what do you have to show for it that actually changed anyone's life? You're the second most effective legislator according to some academic study, but can you name one piece of legislation you've passed that a working mother in my district would recognize? Can you name one moment when you used your platform to fight for something that actually mattered, even if it meant making enemies?" The questions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last, each one exposing the gap between Neguse's carefully cultivated image and his actual impact. Neguse tried to defend his record, pointing to his work on wildfire prevention, his efforts on public lands, his bipartisan accomplishments that had earned him praise from across the political spectrum. But Crockett wasn't interested in hearing about process victories or inside the Beltway accomplishments. She wanted to know when he had last taken a real political risk, when he had last stood up to power instead of accommodating it, when he had last done something that might hurt his chances of moving up the leadership ladder. The conversation was getting heated, but it was also getting to the heart of something that had been bothering progressive members for years, the feeling that their leadership was more interested in maintaining relationships than in fighting for their values. The moment that would define the entire encounter came when Crockett looked directly at Neguse and said the words that would eventually make their way into every political newsletter and gossip column in Washington. "Joe, you're not a leader, you're a resume. You've climbed every ladder they've put in front of you, but you've never built anything yourself. You've never inspired anyone. You've never taken a real stand, and you've never made anyone in power uncomfortable. That's not leadership, that's careerism, and it's exactly what's wrong with this party." The silence that followed was deafening, because both of them knew that she had just articulated something that many of their colleagues felt but had never been willing to say out loud. What made Crockett's words so devastating wasn't just their accuracy, but their timing. Neguse had just been elevated to assistant leader, a position that was supposed to cement his status as a rising star in Tutic politics. But here was a sophomore congresswoman who was pointing out that his rise had been built on avoiding controversy rather than creating change. She was suggesting that his entire career had been an exercise in political calculation, rather than political courage. And worst of all, she was doing it at a time when the Democratic Party was facing an existential crisis about its ability to connect with voters and deliver real results. The leak of Crockett's comments to Neguse created an immediate sensation in political circles, but not for the reasons that the establishment expected. Instead of rallying around Neguse and condemning Crockett for her breach of leadership etiquette, many Democratic members found themselves nodding in agreement with her assessment. Progressive groups started sharing quotes from the leaked conversation, highlighting Crockett's point about the difference between resume building and actual leadership. Social media lit up with supporters praising her for finally saying what needed to be said about the party's leadership culture. The response revealed a hunger among Democratic activists for leaders who were willing to fight rather than just accommodate. The contrast between the two representatives became even more stark in the weeks following the leaked conversation. While Neguse tried to downplay the incident and get back to his regular schedule of committee meetings and leadership duties, Crockett doubled down on her message about the need for more aggressive Democratic leadership. She started speaking more frequently about the importance of using power rather than just accumulating it, about the need for leaders who were willing to make enemies in service of their values. Her challenge to Dingell for the DPCC chairmanship became a symbol of a broader challenge to the party's establishment culture. What many people didn't realize was that Crockett's criticism of Neguse was part of a larger strategy that had been months in the making. Behind the scenes, she had been building relationships with other progressive members who shared her frustration with the party's risk-averse leadership style. She had been studying the way that Republicans had transformed their party through aggressive tactics and uncompromising rhetoric, and she believed that Democrats needed to learn from that example. Her confrontation with Neguse wasn't spontaneous. It was a calculated move designed to force a conversation about what Democratic leadership should look like in an era of existential political combat. The ripple effects of the Crockett-Neguse confrontation extended far beyond their personal relationship or even the DPCC chair race. It exposed a fundamental fault line within the Democratic Party between those who believed in working within existing systems and those who believed that those systems needed to be fundamentally challenged. Neguse represented the incrementalist approach. Build relationships, accumulate credentials, work across the aisle, and trust that slow progress is better than no progress. Crockett represented the confrontational approach. Use every platform to fight for your values, make your opponents uncomfortable, and trust that bold leadership will inspire others to follow. The generational divide was also impossible to ignore. While both Crockett and Neguse were relatively young by congressional standards, they represented very different approaches to political power. Neguse had climbed the traditional ladder of political advancement, building the resume and relationships that party elders valued. Crockett had burst onto the scene through viral moments and authentic connections with voters, building a following that transcended traditional political networks. The question was whether the Democratic Party would continue to reward traditional political skills or start valuing the kind of authentic leadership that could actually mobilize and inspire people. Behind closed doors, party leadership was struggling with how to respond to the Crockett phenomenon. On one hand, they recognized her obvious talent and appeal to the base. On the other hand, they were terrified of what might happen if other junior members started following her example and challenging established hierarchies. The last thing they wanted was a party full of Jasmine Crocketts, each one willing to speak truth to power and disrupt carefully managed political calculations. But they also couldn't ignore the fact that her approach was working. She was raising money, building a national profile, and connecting with voters in ways that traditional politicians couldn't match. The media coverage of the Crockett-Neguse tension revealed how hungry political journalists were for a real story about Democratic Party dynamics. For too long they had been covering a party that seemed determined to avoid internal conflict at all costs, even when that conflict might be necessary for growth and change. Crockett's willingness to challenge a popular leader like Neguse gave them something they rarely got: an authentic glimpse into the tensions that were shaping the party's future. The coverage also highlighted how different the two representatives were in their media strategies, with Neguse preferring traditional interviews and statements, while Crockett thrived in social media and viral moments. What made the situation even more complicated was that both Crockett and Neguse had legitimate claims to leadership within the party. Neguse could point to his legislative record, his coalition-building skills, and his ability to work effectively within existing systems. Crockett could point to her communication skills, her ability to inspire grassroots activism, and her willingness to take on tough fights that other Democrats avoided. The question wasn't necessarily who was right or wrong, but what kind of leadership the Democratic Party needed at this particular moment in history. The academic study that had labeled Neguse as the second most effective House Democrat became a flashpoint in the debate about how to measure political effectiveness. Critics pointed out that the study's methodology favored legislators who could get their names on bills that were likely to pass anyway, rather than those who were willing to fight for transformational change that might not succeed immediately. Supporters argued that incremental progress was still progress, and that Neguse's ability to work within the system was exactly what the party needed. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about whether political effectiveness should be measured by output or by impact, by process or by results. As the story continued to unfold, it became clear that the Crockett-Neguse tension was about much more than two individual politicians. It was about the soul of the Democratic Party and its ability to respond to challenges of the modern political era. It was about whether the party would continue to reward insider politics or start elevating authentic leaders who could connect with voters. It was about whether Democrats would learn to fight as aggressively as their opponents or continue to hope that good policy and respectful discourse would somehow be enough to win in an era of existential political combat. The leaked conversation also raised questions about transparency and accountability within Democratic leadership. If Crockett hadn't been willing to speak out, would anyone have challenged the narrative about Neguse's effectiveness? How many other leaders were coasting on reputation rather than delivering real results? How many other junior members had similar concerns but lacked the platform or courage to voice them? The incident suggested that the party's internal dynamics were more fragile and contentious than most people realized. Looking back at the confrontation between Crockett and Neguse, it's clear that it represented a turning point in Democratic Party politics. Whether or not Crockett succeeded in her challenge to Dengel, she had already succeeded in forcing a conversation about what Democratic leadership should look like. She had shown that it was possible to challenge the establishment without destroying the party, and she had demonstrated that authentic leadership could be more powerful than traditional political credentials. The question now was whether other Democrats would follow her example and start demanding more from their leaders, or whether the party would find ways to contain and manage the kind of disruptive energy that she represented. The ultimate irony of the situation was that both Crockett and Neguse were probably exactly what the Democratic Party needed, but at different times and for different purposes. Neguse's coalition-building skills and institutional knowledge were valuable assets in a party that often struggled with internal coordination. Crockett's fighting spirit and authentic connection with voters were equally valuable in a party that often struggled to inspire and mobilize its base. The tragedy was that the party's hierarchical structure made it difficult for both approaches to coexist and complement each other. As the dust settled from their confrontation, both representatives returned to their regular duties, but the conversation they had started continued to reverberate through Democratic circles. Crockett continued her aggressive approach to oversight and communication, building her national profile and inspiring other progressive leaders to be more confrontational. Neguse continued his methodical approach to legislation and coalition building, working to prove that his style of leadership could deliver real results for Democratic priorities. The question remained whether the party could find a way to harness both approaches, or whether it would continue to be divided between those who wanted to fight and those who wanted to accommodate. The story of what Jasmine Crockett said to Joseph Neguse in that closed-door meeting became a symbol of the broader tensions within the Democratic Party, but it also became something more than that. It became a reminder that real leadership sometimes requires difficult conversations, uncomfortable truths, and the willingness to challenge people and systems that everyone else considers untouchable. Whether you agreed with Crockett's assessment or not, there was no denying that she had accomplished something that few politicians ever manage. She had forced people to think differently about power, leadership, and what it really means to fight for your values in the modern political arena.